Hi, I'm David Colodney, and I'm here with Gianna Russo, and we're going to be talking about her new book. It's called "All I See Is Your Glinting: 90 Days in the 90 Days in the Pandemic." And let me tell you a little bit about Gianna first. Gianna Russo is the inaugural wordsmith of the city of Tampa. She is the author of the poetry collections "One House Down" from Madville Publishing, also in 2019, and Moonflower, winner of the Florida Book Award. She has published poems in Green Mountain Review, Gulfstream, Negative Capability, Crab Orchard Review, Appalachia Review, The Sun, Poet Law, Lore, Saw Palm, The MacGuffin, Florida Review, Tampa Review, Ekphraxis, Florida Humanitarian Florida Humanities Council Forum, Karamu, the Bloomsbury Review, and Calix, among others. She is assistant professor of English and creative writing at St. Leo University and serves as St. Leo's inaugural poet in residence for the College of Arts and Sciences and scholarly journal Rebus. A third-generation Tampa native, a mother and grandmother, Gianna lives in an almost 100-year-old bungalow with her husband, Jeff Karen, and their cat, Ginkgo. Gianna, welcome.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. I'd love for you to start off by just maybe reading a couple of poems from the book, if that's okay.
I would love to. If it's all right with you, I want to explain a little bit about these poems. They have been described as haiku-like, but I came up with a form for these poems that I call the daily. And the daily is a form that's based on number of words. And I came up with the number of words for each one of these based on the number for the month and the number for the day that I was writing on. So I'm going to start with the first poems in the book, which were written in October of 2020. We were deep in the pandemic. We were not yet looking at a vaccine. So, things felt kind of unstable. Anyway, that 10-1, that first poem, 10-1, is only 11 words long. So you're going to hear a little clutch of these poems, and they're very short. 10-1, and these particular ones are set in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. 10-1, leaves goldening, but not enough to block the wild boar world. 10-2, how distant it seems that night, toasting friendship on a glittering riverbank. 10-3, dining out was one happiness. At home, caution sets the table. Wine trembles. And 10-4, Venus, a pewter lamp, dogs us along the mountaintop. Virus and death stalk even here. So those are just the opening for the very first page. They're all laid out together. And what was cool about doing the poems in this form is that, every day you're adding a word. So by the time we got to the end of the month, we had more substantial poems. They were still pretty short, but, 40 words or something, 41 words. And it was fun to see that progress. So yeah, those are my opening dailies from the book.
As I was reading the book, I thought the daily was kind of a fascinating concept. Like, can you talk a little bit about how you came up with that and how it all came together?
Sure, I absolutely can, because it was a scary story for me. And what happened is that I was granted a sabbatical for that fall of 2020. Of course, I was granted it about a year in advance. And I actually had proposed a completely different project. I was going to do a nonfiction memoir type biography of my grandfather that, had a lot of memoir type elements in it. But as we got into spring with the pandemic, and then into the summer, we had, the murder of George Floyd and a lot of civil unrest. And then the election, the presidential election. I mean, it was just such a difficult time for all of us. I found I could not write what I originally thought I was going to be able to write. It just it just was overwhelming to me. And then I started freaking out. So, I started these poems in October. This is like in September. I'm now freaking out because I have this wonderful sabbatical, the first sabbatical in 42 years of teaching. And I thought, oh my God, I cannot squander this. And I've got to be able to report back to the university and tell them this is what I did with the wonderful time you gave me. So one morning I thought, you're putting too high a bar for yourself, and it's stymieing you. You're not being able to write. So just lower the bar. Just start writing some stuff. It doesn't have to be anything, that you really do anything with. You just have to have something to say, this is what I did with my time. And I don't know exactly how I came up with the daily, but I just thought, let me write something really small with no sort of ambition about where this little thing is going to go, and see what happens. And I found out that really once I started on these dailies, it was so much fun. It was just a blast, and it was really freeing too, because as I said, I didn't start writing these thinking I would collect them into a book at all. I just wanted to have something I could show for my time off. And the other part of writing them was that of course I was reading a lot of news and other things too at the time. And I started paying a lot of attention to words that kind of popped for me when I was reading them. And I started making long lists of words that I thought were really interesting. I ended up with several pages of like legal size paper with columns of just words that I thought were really cool words. And ultimately I started working some of those words in, like I think the word pewter, I in that fourth poem I read, pewter was one of those words. There's a lot of them that got worked in. Goldening was one of them. They were interesting words. So that's my story of the dailies. And, I ended up writing 100 of them. And that took me, actually, it took me to January 8th. And ultimately, I decided there were about 10 poems I didn't want to include in this. So I ended up with 90.
It's funny you mentioned that, you kind of wrote them in these long columns, because in the book, that's sort of the way the form, I mean, obviously, with 40 or 30 words, it's, not that long, but they're all kind of shaped like columns. Was that sort of, as you were writing them, did that come into your thinking that this would be what they would look like at some point?
No, that was pretty intentional. And I don't know, it was just, there was no reasoning behind it. But I decided I would have lines that were only 2 or 3 words, occasionally 1. Part of it, I think, is because I had been reading the Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude by Ross Gay. And if you look at that book, he writes in these long, narrow lines. And I liked it. I liked how it looked. I liked how it flowed. And I don't know, that might be a subconscious influence, but I did decide at some point that I only wanted to do those short lines.
It works really well, I think, for telling the story of in the daily form, which kind of, you mentioned haiku, I think, and they're very imagey. At what point did the idea of writing a 90-day cycle of poems enter your thinking?
I think I'm not really sure if there was a complete like conscious decision, but I again, I had in my mind that I had to be able to bring something back to the university. That was part of it. But the other part of it was I just ended up having a lot of fun because I wasn't putting any pressure on myself to make this into a grand piece of art. I really wasn't. I just thought, let me just write what I'm writing. And, I didn't do a whole lot of revising on a lot of them. So once I got started, I didn't want to stop. And then I got to the end of the year, 2020, I think that was like I don't know, 92 poems. And I thought, oh, come on, you can't stop at 92. You can go to 100. But like I said, there were some that just the mood didn't quite fit with some of these other ones. So I ended up taking those out for the book. And what happened with the book was that I have a young colleague at St. Leo, a very accomplished poet. Her name is Anne Barngrover, and I really admire her. And she's, again, she's quite young and very much in the know. And I said, Anne, would you look at these? Because I don't even know if I could do anything with these. What do you think? And, she was very generous. She read the whole manuscript and she said, I think it works as a book. Why don't you send it to your publisher and see what she thinks? So I have to give her, gratitude for that.
Is that when you kind of realized you might be onto something?
Well, that was when I was finished. I had already finished. I had already written all of the poems, and then I started thinking, well, gosh, maybe I could do something with them besides just saying I wrote all these little poems. So when I approached Kim Davis, who is the publisher, at Madville Publishing, she's our publisher. She's so wonderful, and she said to me, gosh, it would be so fun and so great to match these up with some visual images. And my friend Jenny Carey is a very accomplished photographer. She's here in Tampa, and I've admired her work for a long time. So I approached her and asked her if she wanted to work with me to kind of put together this book. And that's what we did. Ultimately we chose them together, but she sort of proposed certain images and sets of images, and we chose them together. And we matched one image to every page. And most pages of poetry have between 2 and 4 poems because they're so little. So there's 40 pages of images, and there are about 40 pages of poetry.
The images just kind of really add a depth to the book. It's like, I think when I first read it, it was sort of like, I thought it was kind of an ekphrastic in reverse, like the artwork kind of supplemented the words. And I thought that was fascinating. And I guess I was always curious, like, did Jenny take these photos kind of around the same time frame, or were they photos she had and they just kind of worked out in the book?
To my knowledge, these are all photos that she had already taken or was taking without ever thinking about me. She may have been working on some of these at the same time I was working on poetry, but we didn't come together until all of the poetry was written. So that was like in January or February of 2021. That's when we first came together. So when I've heard her talk, and she's talked with me about these images, she's had a number of them. She's had them for, maybe months, maybe even a couple of years. I'm not really sure the dates on all of them. But to get back to kind of your question and your pondering, it wasn't the sort of collaboration where we were working side by side. We weren't, but it was really cool to come together with 2 different art forms and go, gosh, we think that they mesh in this way. So
yeah, that's one of the things that's really beautiful about the book, is that it wasn't a conscious effort to put these photographs with the words. It just kind of just seemed to fit together, without planning.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I mean, Jenny was so great. I learned a lot from her about how photographers think about exhibiting their work. She asked me to look at a number of photos. I mean, maybe over 100. I don't know how many. And I was just picking them kind of randomly here, there. These, I like this, I like this, I like this. And then she started showing me and teaching me that really the photos needed to have a progression. They needed to speak to each other. The one in front needed to speak to the one behind. And then, that was so interesting. So when you look at the book, you'll see kind of little little sets, I guess I'd call them, of photos that are sort of talking to each other. Maybe they're the same subject from different angles. It's really interesting. And then, of course, then you're thinking about how are these photos then relating to the poems? And that was very intuitive on our part, I think. We did choose them together, and I'm not sure I can even articulate why I chose certain ones, except that there was just sort of a gut feeling that, oh yeah, this is capturing a mood or a tone or an idea, and then we would just go from there. So
It's great. So the book takes us into 2021. What was it like for you when 2020 finally ended and we were going into New Year's of 2021?
God, that's such a loaded question. I mean, well, I'll just speak from my own experience. First of all, as an artist, I was so, so grateful that I had art to turn to as a balm and a salve in the latter half of 2020, because it was so brutal. At least that's how it felt to me, with everything that was happening to us as a country. And then on a personal level too, because we had friends and family who got COVID and got sick. We had sort of members of the extended family who died from COVID. There was all the political upheaval and conspiracy theories about the vaccines and about COVID. It really was a schism, for a lot of people. And in certain ways, it certainly was for our family as well. So I was relieved when we got the vaccine. That happened in November, so that was towards the end of the year. Then we had to get through all the stuff with the election, and that was, again, brutal. And then all of the murders of Black people, that was brutal too. So when 2020 came, I think I was not really relieved. I felt very wary. I felt very wary, like also where are we going to go now with all this?
Yeah.
And that's,
Well,
yeah.
well, in 1/1/21, the last poem in the book, you write, "We won't look back, not forward either," which I found kind of stunning. I guess that does kind of illustrate this ambivalence you were feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Like I'm almost afraid to think about what's going to come next because of what's been going on. So, I mean, as 2021 went on, I don't know. We're still in a weird place. It's not as awful as it was at that moment, but it's still pretty kind of rough.
It is rough. And yet I found, I at least when I read it, the sense of optimism ultimately in that you conclude the book, the very last word you use in the book is wishes. And I thought that despite how, rough things were, wishes is about as optimistic a word as a person can use, I think. So I thought that was great that it ended like that.
Thank you. I mean, that's another reason I didn't include some of the rest of the poems, because the ones after that are real downers.
I would have loved to have read 1/6/21. But I guess concluding with New Year's Day, the holidays in the pandemic were obviously a lot different. And I found the holiday poems kind of very, particularly poignant, when you put it in context of what was going on. I think it's 12/25 where you're writing of ambivalent anticipation, and you note the lit trees smaller, which I thought was a really effective way to describe things that were going on and how the holidays, I mean, we're all used to pretty gigantic holiday gatherings that like 2019, they were pretty good get-togethers.
Yeah.
2020 and probably for the near future, not so much. How were the 2020 holidays for you, and how different were they?
Well, I, Ambivalent is a good word. I'm trying to think of other words that, encompass opposing feelings. There was a lot of stress, and a lot of the people that we were always typically would get together with, we weren't getting together with for a variety of reasons. I think you did talk about trying to be, some optimism, and I do know that there was a feeling of sadness, but I was really trying, and I think that writing this book helped me with that. My husband and I were really trying to focus on gratitude, and at the same time that we're holding all this, sadness and a sense of loss and upset, but still trying to focus on gratitude and keeping our eye on the ball of small things that are wonderful that are still in our lives. And, most of those are not, yes, there's people, absolutely. But then there's a whole lot of other things that are not people that are just, you just pay attention to them. They're wonderful. They're little gifts. And I think, David, this as poets that, our one of our biggest, I guess you would call it, skills that we can hone is the power of observation, and not just observing visually, but kind of observing with all your senses, but also with your heart. So I think there was a lot of that in that December. There really was.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I guess this is kind of a question I had about kind of about the holiday poems, actually. You continue with, I guess, the daily theme of dating them. So, Christmas Day isn't Christmas Day in the book, it's 12/25. Was there a reason you chose not to mention a specific holiday or event?
No, not really. There wasn't a reason. I just was sticking with the plan that I'd set out for myself. Now, in the back of the book, there are notes, and I did note some of those dates. Like my mother's birthday is coming up. It's November 4th. She's passed on, but of course, I think of her on her birthday. So I did note that. And then one friend of mine said, "Well, you don't have to put 12/25 as Christmas in the notes. Everybody knows that." But I thought, well, I'm putting it anyway. I'm going to put it anyway.
Why not?
But there was no real reason why I stuck with that, other than just going.
You dedicate two poems to New Year's Eve, though.
Yes. And part of the reason is because I did write a couple of poems on that day, but also because I wanted to end the book on an upper and on a round number. I did not want to end on a 91 or an 89. So the only way I could figure out to do that was to have these two poems at the end. One of them is during the day, and one of them is like, is it the next morning, or I can't remember. There's two of them on New Year's Eve. So one of them's during the day and one of them's at night. So, there's a lot of this little slightly obsessive behavior going on, but that's all right.
Yeah, but we're poets. It happens like that sometimes.
Exactly.
So over the course of the first 9 months of the pandemic, and one of the things I always thought was interesting is that I think, especially as poets, we kind of buy the trope or cliche that, springtime is a time of renewal and rebirth. And yet for us, spring of 2020 was kind of the opposite. That's when, you look back and it's more almost about death than birth at this point. Over those first 9 months of the pandemic, how do you think you changed as a person or as a poet?
God, wow, that's such a good question. Oh my goodness. Well, as a poet, this is part of this project too, is I lowered the bar for myself. And I'm not talking about for a finished product, but for the start on a product, on a poem. I think somewhere in me, I remembered words from a very, very early talk that I went to, probably way back in the 70s. And the talk was by William Stafford. And William Stafford was such a prolific poet. He wrote a poem a day at least for decades. And somebody said to him, "How do you write so much?" And he said, "Lower your standards." And really what he meant, I think, or at least the way I've interpreted it, is when you're trying to get that first draft out, don't censor yourself. Don't worry about things being great. Just lower your standards. And I've really embraced that. And I think I embraced it a lot during this writing time. So I'm glad you asked me that. I've taken to kind of using that with my students, my writing students, who will often one or more of them will talk about getting stuck, and I can't get started, or I don't know how to, kind of do whatever. And I've taken to talking about this, lowering your standards for yourself, because it's very freeing. And that's what I did for this book. I said, I'm not going to try to write something that I can publish. I'm just going to write something that I can say, look, I wrote something. So that's one of the ways that I was definitely changed as a poet. And I think it's for the better, because it has allowed me not to be so uptight with just getting raw words on a page. It's really been freeing. A lot of those words in those pages end up not going anywhere ultimately, but how are you going to know if they're going to go anywhere if you don't put them down? So that has really been freeing to me. It really has. How did I change as a person? I think I'm a little bit sadder, unfortunately. And wary is the word that keeps coming. I'm wary. I'm sort of wary of, of the country. I'm wary of our country, and I'm probably wary for sure of some of my fellow citizens. And that being said, I think, one of the good things, it would, especially like working through things with COVID, where we had a number of, as everybody did, we had a number of people around us whose ideas about COVID and the world were completely different than ours. And that was so hard to deal with. But, I think the people that matter to us, we have been able to work through that. And that's been really great. That's really, so I don't know how to exactly categorize that. Maybe it's just persevering, and I don't know. I don't know how to categorize it. It's just something that has happened.
Yeah. I mean, learning to deal with people who are important to you, who share some different views, is something I think we're all struggling with a lot, especially now. And I think if we can come to terms, not just poets, but as citizens, as human beings, if we can come to terms with that, let's hope that can spread, because it would certainly put the country in a better place, I think, than it is now, and certainly where I fear it might be heading. Getting back to something you said at the beginning, I think you had mentioned taking a sabbatical, first sabbatical in 42 years, and you're going to write a nonfiction project. It turned into a collection of poems. Do you sometimes think, and this is not to slight any other form of writing, of course not, but do you think sometimes poetry is just a better outlet to express these types of emotions that you're trying to convey in the book, as opposed to prose or nonfiction, fiction?
That's another good question. I don't know if it's a better outlet, but it's a better outlet for me. I was definitely born a poet. I was born and shaped to be a poet when I was a kid, and it wasn't conscious, but my mother read all these nursery rhymes to me, and read me poems, and read me stories, and my mother and father loved to sing. So it's almost like I internalized rhythm and rhyme, the way lines should flow. And I mean, it's still very, a lot of it's really intuitive to me. So for me, it's better. But I do love nonfiction. I'm not a fiction writer. I can't do it. It's difficult for me, but um, I do like nonfiction and I do write nonfiction, but poetry seems to get at the heart of a lot of things. So for me, it works well.
Yeah, I think it does because you have to strip away a lot of stuff. You've got constraints on space and line and stuff, and I think it kind of makes getting to the point a little more important sometimes, and you can get there a little bit quicker. But I understand what you're saying. I spent several years as a newspaper writer, and there, of course, brevity is a thing too. But now I know when I try to write something in prose, I automatically like start doing line breaks and stuff. Like so it's yeah, once you're a poet, it's kind of sticks with you. And stuff. You mentioned nursery rhymes and stuff. Was that your first kind of brush with poetry? Because like I always use the term stumble into poetry because it all seems to we all seem to bump into it somehow. And can you tell me how that evolved? Like obviously you were young
Well,
and
my parents were avid readers, and uh, they loved the arts. They didn't work in the arts in any way, but they loved the arts and they loved music. And I mean, that was just part of our home life. And I guess I was the eldest. And so I think my mom, had at least a 3-year head start with me as opposed to my sisters, where she could spend time with me. And yeah, she bought me this set, or they bought me a set of childcraft books. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but these are books that came out probably in the 50s, maybe 60s too. And they were almost like a set of encyclopedias, but what they had in them were poems and nursery rhymes and tales, like the tale of Pocahontas or Daniel Boone or whatever, and they were illustrated in color. And so I had a whole set of them. There was like 10 or 12 of them, and they would progress from early nursery rhymes. Then the next one would be a little more advanced and advanced, probably going up into middle elementary school. So I'm sure that mom, introduced me to nursery rhymes through those childcraft books, and I would just look at them all the time. And then when I got a little bit older, but I was still like very young, like in elementary school, I would write books, and I would have my mother staple the pages together so that I had a little book. And I would illustrate those too, by the way. And I also had a pen name, which was Cleo. and and then I also spent a lot of time outside. I love being outside, and I did as a kid. And I would get on my swing, and I would make up songs and poems to the swing, to the rhythm of that swing. And so, it's just in me. It's
mm,
just in me.
that's great. So who would you say your biggest influences are as a poet?
Well, of course, they've changed over the years. They've changed. Some of my favorites for the last 5 years or so, I would say, are contemporary poets. I love Natasha Trethewey. I love what she writes about. I love the fact that she uses form. I love her subject matter. I think she's superb. Love her work. I mentioned Ross Gay. He's another hero of mine. He and Amy, and I don't want to mispronounce, but Amy
Yes.
Amy Nez. They are holding down kind of the corners right now of joy and delight, in my opinion. I don't see a whole lot of that happening pervasively, but the two of them are invested in it, and I really appreciate that about both of them. I think we need a lot more of that. But he in particular is a poetic hero of mine. I love his style. It's rolling and rollicking, and then he has a lot of compassion in his poems, just tremendous compassion. They all have that in them. I love Terrence Hayes. I think he's just incredible. His work is is mind-blowing. It's so creative, it's so innovative, and he doesn't shy away from any of the difficult subjects at all. I really like Natalie Diaz for the same reason. Wonderful poet, and she also experiments quite a bit with formal verse. So those are some, and of course I have to throw her in there, although I know she's maybe a little bit controversial because some people think she doesn't have all that much going for her, but I still love Mary Oliver because I'm a big nature freak and I just love her appreciation of nature. And as her poems, as she got older and started writing more and more poetry, there's the deep spirituality in her poems, and there's a real questioning about our place in the world and what the world is and what does it mean to be a spiritual being. She doesn't use any of those words. I'm using them, but I like that. I like that about her work.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's great, and I think it holds up. I mean, I think it's still timely. Last question for you. So we've talked about your new book. What's next for you?
Oh, well, I'm working on a chapbook right now, and have you ever heard the term flood subject?
Mm-mm.
Flood subject.
No.
Apparently, it's attributed to Emily Dickinson, and a poet's flood subject is sort of the subject that they always return to. And I was so unaware of myself that I didn't realize that Florida is really my flood subject. It definitely is. And so right now I'm working slowly on a small chapbook, which is based on endangered and threatened flora in Florida. And I was brought to this by another friend of mine who is a potter, and she's done a whole series on endangered and threatened wildflowers. And she and I both share a love of wildflowers and gardening. And she asked me to think about writing some poems to this, and so that's what I'm doing.
Cool.
It's really cool.
It sounds
really
great.
Cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for talking to me and to us, and best of luck with the book. It's all I see is your glinting 90 days in the pandemic. This is Gianna Russo, and thank you so much.
It was such a pleasure, David. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Take care. Be well.
Bye.